now on BBC One, it's time for the last in the series of Doctor Who. Yes, it's still going. I was surprised too.
So hello. This is almost the last in a short series of short videos reflecting on Disney-era Doctor Who. And in this presentation, I invite you to consider the representation of disabled people in a show that BBC commissioned comedians recently ridiculed for its perceived cringeworthy approach to championing diversity and inclusion.
Hey, Commander Stewart, what's going down, babes? Give me a hug.
Hug?
Sure, I've got to hug everybody in this room because that's the kind of woke, touchy-feely doctor I am now. Can't leave any minority behind. Okay, wheelchair-bound lady, give me a hug. Ethnic man, here comes a hug. Trans person, it's hugging time. Gay robot, you is in for one heck of a hug. Show me the lovin'.
The reaction to this clip has been interesting to see. It's basically divided amongst like two groups. The first group are Doctor Who fans who actually watch the show and they're like, what the fuck is this? Like, what on earth are you doing? And the other half are basically racists who are like, this is so funny. This is so great. You've hit the nail on the head here. So effectively, with this skit, they've basically just made comedy for Nazis.
And although this really shouldn't have to be said, like most rational and reasonably minded people, I tend to take an entirely non-binary approach to most matters, which in this case means that while I wholeheartedly support the BBC's commitment to diversity, equality and inclusion, I also believe that it's entirely reasonable to comment on outcomes arising from their approach and point to potential areas for improvement. And what's more, I sincerely believe that people should have the human right to voice their personal opinions without having to navigate childish chill factories created by self-appointed gatekeepers seeking to coercively control or shut down open adult discourse by inferring that anyone who doesn't think like them must be an istphobe or worse.
These guys will commit terrorism, and that's not even a joke, that's just a demonstrable fact.
So with that all said, let's proceed to the not uncomplicated matter of considering how well or otherwise Disney-era Doctor Who has contributed to the BBC's commitment to improving the on-screen representation of disabled people, with a focus on both the quality and quantity of representation.
At last, you finally caught up with the 21st century.
According to the guidelines that Bad Wolf Productions will themselves presumably have followed, a person's perceived disability should be counted when it is clearly referenced or becomes evident to the viewer, either through explicit audio or visual references. So by way of example, the disability representation head count will be at least one for each episode featuring an appearance from Unit Scientific Advisor Shirley Ann Bingham, as there are frequent explicit references to her physical disability.
We haven't got a penny, but I've got this wheelchair. State of the art. And God knows with my spina bifida I need medicine.
Guidance defines a disabled person as someone who has a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term impact on their ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. In one episode, we encounter a soldier with a sensory impairment, although in a crucial plot point, we also learn that had he lived long enough, his eyesight would have returned in roughly 4 weeks. Therefore, while the impact of his impairment is substantial in the immediate, doesn't qualify as a disability, because it is not long-term, as in 12 months or more.
Pardon me if I don't frisk you, but you seem very non-disabled to me.
Meanwhile, a major challenge for content creators is that 70 to 80% of disabilities are invisible, or at least not immediately apparent. So, for example, when the Doctor meets 3 of his fans, it quickly becomes evident to the viewer that one has a physical disability. And based on subsequent interactions...
Oh God, you're so annoying.
Lots of people say that. But we don't care.
It is possible that another has a cognitive neurodevelopmental disability such as autism that affects social interactions and behaviour, although I'm not certain we're provided sufficient information to make a definitive determination. And overall, I've struggled to identify any definitive examples of hidden disabilities that become evident to the viewer through explicit storyline references.
Morning, Winnie Love. Another day in paradise.
In the final 2 episodes, we are introduced to a camp full of people who are all explicitly identified as disabled. 3 characters are credited with speaking parts, so our head count definitely rises by 3, and could rise further depending on whether or not we perceive that any of the non-speaking background characters have any effect on the action. Anyway, long story short, and depending if we choose to count the non-speaking camp members, I estimate a total disability representation headcount ranging from 4 to 12%. With no clear representation of the approximate 50% of disabilities categorised as either cognitive, mental or other, something which highlights the complexities of disability representation on screen, and clearly respectfully representing impairments such as schizophrenia or bipolar disorder could be particularly challenging, especially in the context of a family entertainment show. Mind you, at least one person has proposed a rather radical off-screen correlation between mental illness and Doctor Who. We'll get to that theory in a bit, but for now I'll observe that 12% would be an extremely generous overall head count, because there is a fairly convincing argument as to why we shouldn't count roughly 27 of the 30 disabled characters crammed into a camp at the very end of the Disney Doctor run. The campers are introduced in an episode centred around a utopian vision of contemporary Britain that has somehow been wished into existence by Conrad, a straight, non-disabled white male character with perceived right-wing political views. His is a Wishworld where women do the washing, men bring home the bacon, everyone is warm and fed and happy, and people with disabilities sort of don't exist. I say sort of because unlike transgender people, who are simply unimagined completely out of existence, disabled people are portrayed more so as simply invisible to everybody else.
He's not disabled, so he literally can't see us. And if he can't see us, well then we don't get seen.
It's a powerful premise that draws attention to the impact of prejudice and how narrow viewpoints can lead to the marginalisation and effective erasure of disabled people from the narrative of a society. Expanded across an entire episode, it could have made for potentially compelling and chilling drama, especially given the government's current plans to cut state protection for over 1 million disabled people. But in the context of Wishworld, we witness characters with little to zero agency or effect. As Doctor Who TV reviewer Gustav Baer observed, the story's biggest issue is that it piles on even more plots in a season already brimming with unresolved threads. This side quest had absolutely no impact on the main narrative and distracted from the core story. In fact, if you removed the entire subplots, the only real consequence would be Conrad appearing slightly less bigoted. I feel the most sympathy for actress Ruth Madeley, not just because her character is once again reduced to a prop to showcase someone else's prejudice, but because this isn't even the first time Doctor Who has done this to her. A little while ago, Big Finish ran a storyline in which a bigoted scientist targeted a different disabled character, also played by Madeley, specifically because of her disability, culminating in, wait for it, a dystopian world where the disabled are erased. That arc was, to put it mildly, not well received, and now here we are again. Same actress, same franchise, almost the exact same story. What kind of message are we meant to take from this? That disabled characters only exist to be persecuted as shorthand for societal rot? That Ruth Madeley's entire narrative function is to suffer so others can learn empathy? It's lazy, reductive and frankly insulting. If this is what counts as representation, then the bar isn't just low, it's buried.
No sign of life, but we're moving out to secure the site.
Good work, soldier. Go get it. Yeah, not you, mate. I've got this. Off you pop.
In fairness, across all of her appearances, Ruth Madeley's character wasn't entirely defined by her disability. And at least to some extent, there is an aspect of damned if you do mention it and damned if you don't.
That's, sorry about the stairs, but Geneva says to go in immediately.
Don't make me the problem, just get in there.
Some found her rocket-propelled and rocket-propelling wheelchair somewhat cheesy, but then again, it was very much in the tradition of Doctor Who's ability to inject magical qualities into otherwise mundane and everyday objects.
I want to save the world.
That said, her personal characteristic was pointed at or picked on.
He's collecting benefits, stealing our taxes while he lies to us.
In every single episode she appeared.
For her in that chair. I've seen you walk. I've seen you walking. Don't deny it.
And the perception that, to some extent, she primarily existed to tick a box in the production's paperwork isn't helped by the revelation that disabled child genius Morris Gibbons only got the gig at short notice because Madeley was busy elsewhere. Even so, they were lucky to get him. By the time of his brief appearance in season 1, 14-year-old Lenny Rush had already won a BAFTA, and with doors definitely opening across the industry, who knows what roles the future may bring. So I don't mean to appear to be unduly harsh about the BBC's track record when it comes to employing and representing disabled people. They have clearly made significant efforts in recent years, and both their Elevate and Extend initiatives focused on removing barriers for people who want to work in the industry are models I'd like to see other big employers adopt. Indeed, the main point I'm really seeking to highlight with this analysis is how disabled people all too often appear to be at the back of the queue when it comes to narratives and demands around diversity, equality and inclusion. For example, say what you want about the gender pay gap, but it frequently manages to generate headlines, including about the BBC, even though comparatively it is significantly lower than the disability pay gap, measured amongst people fortunate enough to have access to a job. According to the Beeb's most recent annual reports, black and minority ethnic representation is significantly higher on screen than behind the scenes. Presumably one challenge they encounter in this area is that black and minority ethnic populations across Great Britain vary widely, from 64% in London to 6% in Wales, where 70% of Doctor Who's backstage crew, including Russell T Davies, are based. By contrast, 21% or 1 in 5 people in Wales have a disability, which is broadly similar to the GB average, and yet the BBC have still to achieve their comparatively modest goals, currently set at 12%. Meanwhile, disability is the only DEI area where the BBC have yet to achieve their perceived and actual on-screen representation targets. My 4% estimate for the Disney Doctor is similar to the BBC's current overall percentage, something which indicates a lack of imagination, given that this is one area where publicly funded programme makers are permitted to be extremely discriminating indeed. Because there is an exception to the relatively strict rules around equality of opportunity that allow employers to discriminate specifically based on characteristics, if it is absolutely necessary to do the job. Something which is extremely hard to justify behind the scenes, but for reasons of authenticity, can be widely applied during the casting of fictional on-screen characters. For example, when Bad Wolf Productions wanted to recreate a bustling African marketplace on a soundstage in Cardiff, or for that matter a planet populated exclusively by white supremacists.
Play Ricky September.
They were perfectly within their rights to only employ British-based actors with personal characteristics that help them to do this more convincingly. Who knows, previous feedback about historical inaccuracies may even have been the reason why we got a rare positive portrayal of straight white dudes in the second episode of season 1. So on reflection, that disability discriminating Wishworld was an interesting metaphor for Russell T Davies to run with, when you consider the relative absence of disabled people from the narrative across his first 60 episode run, and perhaps even more so in the context of the political and corporate conditions that will have informed his second term in charge. By way of example, for the last 2 seasons, Doctor Who appears to have met the criteria for a share in the BBC's £100 million budget, exclusively ring-fenced for inclusive productions, on the basis that it met the diverse on-screen talent criteria by including 2 or more characters associated with one of 3 underrepresented groups. A criteria that, by my estimation, Doctor Who has consistently met since 2018, with the notable exception of 3 episodes starring a Doctor who was notoriously lectured on the shortcomings of his personal protected properties. Notably, Disney-era Doctor Who qualifies based on lead characters from black and minority ethnic or working class backgrounds, or both, as opposed to the third possible, disabled people option. So in other words, if Russell T Davies wants to see more disabled people on screen, all he really has to do is dream them up. as opposed to quite literally wishworlding them out of existence, which is something he did in the very first scene of Disney-era Doctor Who.
Things used to be in black and white, they're not in black and white anymore, and Davros used to look like that, and he looks like this now.
Because a week before the first episode proper, fans retreated to a mini-episode and indirect prequel to the 1970s classic, Genesis of the Daleks, featuring Davros, the mad scientist who created the Doctor's most famous foe. Davros is usually depicted as half man, half Dalek, and reliant upon a mobile life support unit to survive. In the prequel, his character was clearly able-bodied, so many just assumed it was set in his timeline before he sustained his life-changing injuries. However, in an accompanying interview, Russell T Davies clarified that his depiction as able-bodied was in fact a deliberate reimagining designed to avoid any further promotion of the evil cripple trope.
Time and society and culture and taste has moved on, and there's a problem with the Davros of old in that he's a wheelchair user who is evil. And I had problems with that, and a lot of us on the production team had the problems with that, of associating disability with evil. And trust me, there's a very long tradition of this.
Clearly the change was well intended, but it also proved to be controversial, and even arguably helped to doom Disney Doctor Who to failure before it even properly got underway. Because by then, plenty of critics were primed to pounce on any perception of political correctness, in what was essentially a much anticipated course correction, after Chris Chibnall's underwhelming and controversial contribution to the canon.
Whoops.
This led to a reasonably promising run of anniversary specials, being undermined by headlines about a woke Davros, a Star Beast's preferred pronouns, and the Doctor fancying a mixed-race Isaac Newton. As one contributor to Disability Arts Online put it, Davros' transformation felt like being told how to feel about something without being asked.
I say this is how we see Davros now.
And that it would have come across as less preachy and patronising had they just done it without all the grandstanding behind the scenes. Meanwhile, the problem with tropes is that there are an awful lot of them to avoid, and indeed throwing off a character's disability is a trope in and of itself. The website tvtropes.org lists hundreds, including plenty that popped up during the Disney Doctor run.
Alright, give me a break.
And it notes that tropes are not the same thing as cliches. They may be brand new, but seem trite and hackneyed. They may be thousands of years old, but seem fresh. They're not bad, they're not good. Tropes are tools that the creator of a work of art uses to express their ideas to the audience. It's pretty much impossible to create a story without them. In retrospect, casting a disabled person in the role of Davros would have been the more progressive move, because such a bold declaration against associating disability with evil effectively limited the scope of roles open to disabled actors in a series that generally has a new villain or monster every single week. And incidentally, when Russell inevitably broke his own rule at the start of season 2, the role of a villain with a visible on-screen disability appears to have gone to a non-disabled actor.
Help me, save me. Hey.
But with all that said, and once again in all fairness, recent initiatives around disability inclusion has certainly led to more visibility for disabled characters than in previous. And there is one example that merits particular mention. In an episode that Gustav from Doctor Who TV described as a strong, suspenseful and very welcome addition to the Ncuti Gatwa era.
My name is a doctor.
I don't need a doctor, I just want to that home.
Noting that there's a lot to praise, and most importantly, the writing finally doesn't feel weighed down by some sort of heavy-handed message. It actually tries to entertain us rather than preach. The episode standout is Alice Fenley, who Rose Ayling-Ellis plays with such heartfelt sincerity that it is impossible not to feel for her. Her performance is wonderfully layered, especially in the quieter and more panicked moments. And it's also worth noting that she spends a good chunk of the story gaslighting everyone around her, and selfishly insisting they take her home, despite knowing full well the risks she poses to them.
I know you've had a terrible time. We're going to do everything we can to help.
That's so kind.
It is also significant to note that Alice Fenley wasn't originally written as a deaf character, and instead evolved into such after Ailing Alice was considered for a guest star role. Adjustments were subsequently made to ensure she could authentically portray her deaf identity and experiences, whilst maintaining the initial aspects of the character that made her engaging, nuanced and imperfect to begin with, as most people tend to be.
I thought I saw something behind you.
Well, they didn't they? Look at me. I'm all clean.
It's an approach that starts with the essential qualities of a character, well ahead of any predetermination or preoccupation about characteristics. It encourages writers to create convincing character traits first and foremost. Traits that will very often transcend traditional tramlines and preconceived or prejudicial perceptions about what any particular person can be. All of which brings me to Mr. TARDIS.
It's interesting because when I watched this 20 minutes, it was just kind of randomly on, I was pottering around, it was on. I didn't feel as strongly as Andy feels, but I did notice like the diversity of the characters, and I was just like, okay, so this one's this person, this one's this person, this one's this person.
Yeah.
Fine, but I can see why Andy is saying what he's saying.
Sometimes it does feel like you're being lectured to.
Like, Jesus Christ. They'll just let anybody on the BBC nowadays, won't they? But the idea that the existence of a diverse group of people, and you think that the existence of those people is being lectured to? Like, Jesus Christ, what type of thought process is that? It would be lovely if you could point to a specific scene or a specific moment of this so-called lecturing.
So, for the uninitiated, Mr. TARDIS self-identifies as a diversity hire working in the UK television industry. And with over 40,000 subscribers on YouTube, he clearly has his admirers. For me, he is also an example of individuals within the fan base who can present as extremely intolerant towards diversity of thought, and all too often have a tendency to leap to unsubstantiated, ignorant and extremely unflattering claims about other people's perceived character and characteristics, based solely on their personal point of view.
I've come in and said exactly the same thing as Andy. So he's not imagining it, he's not alone, and, you know...
I mean, he kind of is imagining it. I don't think he is alone, but this is essentially some sort of collective schizophrenia, where it is some sort of weird mental illness that is a prerequisite for their political positions. We need to call this what this is, folks. This is mental illness. Like, genuinely. You can have your opinions on the show, you can like or dislike the current regime or whatever, but this isn't even, like, remotely indicative of what the show is currently doing. This is, like, genuine mental illness and just hallucination.
It is pointless attempting to debate them, so for my sake, please don't try, because they can also be very quick to feign and weaponise offence. The main reason I mention them is that they have increasingly convinced me that, as we enter the post-Disney era, Doctor Who really could benefit from an extended time out, at least long enough to sit out the so-called culture wars and fashionable preoccupations with characteristics over character. It seems likely that I may get my wish, but if the BBC do push forward with Russell's current trajectory, then based on the tramlines they have set for themselves, presumably we can at least anticipate a landmark development for the representation of disabled people on our screens. Because, as long-time obsessives may remember, soon after the announcement of the first female Doctor, Russell T Davies revisited his past with a novelisation of the story that brought the Doctor back 20 years ago. When doing so, he took the opportunity to update it with Disney budget-sized set pieces and nods towards things to come, including references to all 4 of Christopher Eccleston's successors up to that point, as well as 2 new incarnations implied as following on from Jodie Whittaker's 13. One of whom was black, with possible LGBT coding, and the second was described as a young girl or boy in a high-tech wheelchair, with what looked like a robot dog at their side. Since then, we have witnessed 4 on-screen incarnations of the Doctor come and go. 2 have been female, 2 have been black, and all 4 have been implied to be both gay and transgender. Therefore, to paraphrase a Guardian headline from around the same period, presumably the next Doctor can and must have a disability. Such a development would certainly see a significant increase in headcount, but quality of representation may be harder to achieve. Then again, such a script writing challenge could genuinely revitalise the show's approach to telling stories that entertain. If they leave it a decade, then maybe Lenny might even be their man. And what's more, that reasonable adjustment to the TARDIS introduced in Ncuti Gatwa's very first episode would finally get some use.
Oh Oh, that's not bad. Wheelchair accessible.
At last! You finally caught up with the 21st century!